Warning. This chapter contains the following content: depictions of blood, gore, and body horror, coarse language, and many other elements that may not be suitable for certain audiences. Proceeding is at your discretion, as the author cannot be held liable for any reactions beyond this point. Enjoy the chapter. Chapter 4. The thundering footsteps grew louder and louder as the group held their breath for what felt like forever. Gabriella peeked through the slight gaping crevice of the tree, looking for any sight of the monster that had taken Ryder. Her eye caught Elizabeth frantically mouthing out to her. The words were shaky, panicked, "Don't move," repeated over and over as if sheer will could force reality to listen. Gabriella nodded once, barely daring to breathe as she pressed her back against the inside of the hollow trunk. The bark felt unnaturally warm against her skin, almost feverish, as if the tree itself were ill with some ancient disease. She could feel it pulsing behind her, a slow, sickening rhythm that matched neither her racing heart nor any natural cadence. A shadow fell across the crevice, blotting out the crimson light. Gabriella froze, not even daring to blink as Zero's massive form stalked past her hiding spot. His claws dragged along the ground, leaving deep furrows in the blood-red clearing. A low hum filled the air, not quite laughter, not quite breathing. Gabriella clamped a hand over her mouth as the sound slid into her head, cold and intimate. "I can hear your heart," the voice whispered. Such a frantic little thing. Across the clearing, Elizabeth pressed Penelope harder against the warped trunk they hid behind. Penelope's breathing had become uneven, shallow gasps she'd struggled to suppress. Elizabeth leaned close to her ear, whispering through clenched teeth. "Penny. Look at me," she murmured. "Count with me." Slowly and quietly. Penelope nodded stiffly, her tears slipping down her face as she mouthed the numbers in silence. 1, 2, 3, the more they silently counted, the more Penelope slightly eased up, but not as much to fully calm her nerves. It's progress and Elizabeth is fine with it regardless, though even she believes it may not provide enough closure to keep her and her sister calm throughout the challenge. Elsewhere across the sea of red grass, Michael and Jonas crouched beneath a tangled mass of roots that pulsed faintly, like veins beneath skin. Jonas's eyes were locked on the shadows beyond the roots, tracking the distortion in the air as something impossibly tall passed by. "He just passed Gabriella, but is dragging his search out," Michael whispered, his voice barely audible. "It looks like he wants us to crack and expose ourselves." Jonas swallowed, readjusting himself carefully to not make noise. "Then let's not give him the satisfaction he wants from finding us. Remember to keep your voice down and not make any sudden moves. Him catching us is the last thing we all need." The temperature around the reddened area had suddenly dropped. The roots around the two boys had stiffened, tightening around and about like a clenched fist. Michael sharply sucked a breath in as the earth shifted and contorted, forcing him to go lower. Jonas acted fast and grabbed his arm, attempting to steady him before the movement could give him away to the monster. Zero inhaled a deep intake of the air and crooned in sadistic delight. "I just love the smell of absolute fear. It makes a man feel alive and well. It will make the satisfaction of killing you all the better." A low chuckle bubbled out of his throat as he took one step, then another, and another. Each footfall landed with deliberate weight, as if he knew exactly how close he was to each of them. Elizabeth's heart slammed against her ribs as Zero's gaze drifted toward the hiding place she and Penelope are located. He tilted his head to the point of nearly snapping the neck, his gaping, grinning maw widening just a fraction. The two sisters froze like a statue, keeping their eyes on the creature staring at their hiding spot. They felt it immediately, that shift, that wrongness, and the way the air had thickened as the monster's attention sharpened like a blade. "No, please. Don't come here," Elizabeth thought frantically, biting her lip to keep herself from making noise. A soft sound had escaped Penelope's throat. It wasn't a scream, or even a gasp, but just a shaky exhaled breath that prompted Elizabeth to smack her hand to her older sister's mouth. However, by then, it was too late to silence the noise as Zero suddenly stopped dead in his tracks. The quietness fell so abruptly it felt violent and harsh. Slowly, agonizingly so, Zero turned his head towards the source of the sound, right where the warped trunk had laid. His claw flexed and twitched as black ichor dripped down onto the ground in slow, lazy strands. "Oh!" Zero growled, voices overlapping his own as he fully turned his entire body, leaving deliberately thunderous footfalls onto the crimson ground. What was that noise? Guess little old me will have to check it out. Elizabeth's eyes darted around as Zero slowly approached the deformed timber. Her eyes landed on a shard of stone in front of Penelope's trembling form and quickly picked it up. Without hesitating, Elizabeth hurled the small stone as hard as she could across the clearing. It collided with the tree just in front left of the roots Michael and Jonas are hidden in with a loud and sharp crack that echoed harshly through the twisted forest. Zero's head snapped towards the sound, his attention wavering for one heart-stopping moment. Elizabeth turned to Gabriella and harshly gestured her to hurry over, mouthing a harsh "get over here" and a "he's distracted." Gabriella looked at Zero, then at Elizabeth, and back at the monster, debating whether or not it'll be appropriate to move. Forced to take her chances, Gabriella slowly stood up and hurried, holding her breath and keeping her footsteps as silent as possible. However, her foot hit a brittle twig, which emitted a loud and sudden snap that caused the entire forest to go silent. One of the large, spidery thorns on Zero's back lashed to the right and he turned his head to the right, just above Elizabeth and Penelope's general direction. Gabriella immediately halted her quickened stride right behind Zero. Her eyes went wider than dinner plates and not daring to move an inch as she kept her gaze right at him. "Don't turn around, don't turn around, don't turn around," her thought rang repeatedly like a desperate mantra just as Zero turned around. Acting fast, Gabriella kept moving behind him to remain out of his sight before hurrying to the sisters before any mishaps occurred. Elizabeth and Penelope reached out and pulled Gabriella closer as the trio softly breathed out in relief. "Sorry, I didn't mean to step on that twig," Gabriella whispered, her own voice barely audible even to her own ears. "It's fine. Though, it seemed that this place is desperately trying to get us killed," Elizabeth whispered back, her eyes remained fixed on Zero's massive form as he stalked toward the sound Gabriella accidentally created. "We need to regroup with Michael and Jonas. This is getting us nowhere but Death's Gate." Penelope pointed to a cluster of twisted roots several yards away from their current location. "Let's go there. We can circle around while he's distracted. Though, let's keep clear of any twigs or whatever is laying around." Elizabeth and Gabriella nodded as the three girls moved as one, crouching low while keeping their gazes halfway at the floor for any potential obstacles and halfway at Zero, who continued to investigate the area where the noise had came from. They moved with synchronization, their bodies hunched as low as possible to avoid detection from the demonic figure. Meanwhile, Michael and Jonas watched from their hiding spot as Zero stalked closer to the sound Elizabeth created. Jonas gripped Michael's shoulder as firm as possible with silent warning to remain still as the monster's bulky form passed within several feet of their hiding place. "I know you're here," Zero crooned, voices overlapping with his own as malice dripped from every word. "You can't hide from me forever. I can smell your fear, taste it in the air. It'll only make your fate far worse than it needed to be from persisting the release of death." The three girls finally reached to the two boys as Elizabeth, Penelope, and Gabriella crouched down beside Michael and Jonas, their breathing shallowed and controlled. Michael's eyes widened with surprise before he quickly composed himself, relieved that the girls are okay, albeit shaken up. Jonas nodded in acknowledgement as the group huddled close together beneath the pulsating roots. "We have 7 more minutes left," Jonas whispered, checking his watch that had its digital display cracked from the impact of being dragged through the earth. "We need to keep moving or else he'll find us all at once. If we stay together, then we'll just be an easier target for him," Michael whispered, his eyes tracking Zero's movements through the gaps in the roots. "But splitting up won't work either," since there'll be a chance he'll tick us down before we can blink. What do we do? Elizabeth peered through the tangled mass, watching as Zero stalked back and forth, his massive head swiveling like a predator catching its prey scents on the wind, muttering where'd they go and that little wretch dare play tricks on me. The thorns twitched and swayed like tentacles as he sniffed the air, his nostrils flaring as he took another deep breath. We need to keep moving and distracting this thing, Elizabeth whispered, her eyes not leaving Zero one bit. He'll find us if we keep staying in one place for too long. Jonas nodded in agreement and pointed towards a dense thicket of malformed trees and stones too sharp and jagged for comfort about 30 yards to their left. Over there. If we can time it right, we can make it while his back is turned. Zero suddenly went rigid, his head twisted at an unnatural angle, bones snapping sickeningly loud as he inhaled the air. Come out, wherever you are. He snarled, his tail whipped behind him, slashing through the air with a sharp whistle. His fingers flexed, claws leaving gouges in the crimson soil as he took another deliberate step forward. Now. Elizabeth mouthed, pointing to the moment when Zero's figure turned away from their hiding spot. All moved immediately out of the roots as one, keeping low and silent across the blood-red grass. Each step felt like forever, the distance to the jagged stone formation stretching impossibly far as Zero continued his menacing, methodical hunt. Elizabeth held her mouth as her eyes darted from the foundation to Zero and back at the structure. Penelope strode beside her sister, locking her arm with Elizabeth's. Gabriella fell behind, trying to catch up close to Michael as he and Jonas flanked the sisters. All of a sudden, a loud roar erupted from Zero's throat behind the group, sending a startled jolt from them as they turned to see the monster charging at them at full speed. There you are. You better start running, little runts. Zero bellowed, his massive form barreling toward them with terrifying speed. His claws raised with the intent to tear through the group's flesh and bones as the footsteps erupted deafeningly louder as he gained on them. The group abandoned all pretense of stealth as they sprinted across the clearing, their hearts hammering in their chests like a drummer at a prep rally as Zero's footfalls closes in behind them. The jagged stone formation loomed ahead, promising momentary shelter if they could just reach it in time. Come on, come on. Elizabeth hissed as she grabbed Penelope by her hand when seeing her older sister slowly falling behind. However, Gabriella tripped over a root that ensnared her ankle. With a yelp, she tumbled to the ground and tried to pry herself free, but the root stubbornly held her in place. No! Michael shouted, skidding to a halt and turned back for her just as Jonas ran past him to get ahead of the moss-covered shelter. Elizabeth and Penelope ducked behind the jagged stones with Jonas, but Michael raced back toward Gabriella, much to his friend's protests. Zero's massive shadow loomed over them both as Michael reached for her, yanking the root that had wrapped itself tighter around her ankle like a sentient trap. Michael, just go. Gabriella cried out as she frantically tried harder to pry herself free from the root's obstinate hold. No. Not without you. Michael snarled as his fingers dug into the cursed plantation. It tightened further, causing Gabriella to yell in pain from the restrictive pressure. Michael, don't be stupid. Jonas shouted from the safety of the rocks, his face etched with panic and distress. That monster is right on top of you. He's going to kill you both if you don't move. Michael's fingers finally found purchase beneath the root, his nails breaking from the crimson earth as he tore at the writhing tendril. With a nauseating squelch, Gabriella was free, though it still latched onto her ankle, not wanting to let go. Just go. Now. Michael demanded as he hauled her to her feet, shoving her ahead of him as Zero's massive hand shot out towards the boy. It found purchase on Michael's ankle as Zero flung him across the clearing with such horrific force. The boy crashed into a tree with a sickening thud, his body sliding down the trunk as he gasped for air, his vision swimming from the pain. Michael! Gabriella screamed, still trying to fight against the root that seemed to tighten with each struggle as she joined with the others, her eyes wide with horror at her injured friend. Zero's grinning maw widened at Michael before he towered over him, his form blotting out the crimson sky as black ichor dripped from his jaws around him. When Michael's vision came back, he was horrified to discover that his foot is ripped off from the joint, torn from its socket in a violent spurt of blood. He screamed, the sound echoing through the twisted forest as his hands desperately clutched at the gruesome wound. "Want to deny me of my kill of little Gabby, huh? Well, let us see how you'll like it when I'm done with you," Zero growled, throwing the severed foot unceremoniously and began to raise his arm high into the air. Claws gleamed like obsidian knives ready to carve into Michael. Such a pathetic attempt of being a hero. Makes me want to break you all the more while your friends watch. Run. Michael gasped through his agony, looking toward his friends. Just run. Elizabeth pulled Gabriella backward as she fought against her, trying desperately to reach to Michael. "No. We can't leave him." Gabriella sobbed, clawing at Elizabeth's restricted gaze as tears fall down her face. "Mikey." A vicious slash and flesh tearing filled the air when Zero's claws made contact to Michael's face. Michael couldn't even urge a scream when his face peeled open, the skin and flesh brutally peeling away to reveal his bloodied skull underneath. One of his eyes popped out of the socket and deflated from the massive gash it had suffered. Blood and clear fluid spilled from Michael's face as he struggled to breathe through the frying pain. His remaining eye looked up at Zero, helplessly watching as the monster dug into his stomach and pulled out his intestines with a sickening squelch. Michael convulsed and tried reaching out, his mouth opened in a silent scream before his remaining eye rolled back. Zero held up the bloody organ in front of his face, dangling it without a care. "Look at it, Vessel," he purred, his voice a horrific chorus of overlapping tones as a monotonous cry escaped from within his chest. "Your little friend came apart so beautifully." "No, Michael." Gabriella screamed, her eyes wide with despair as her voice shredded her throat raw while having Jonas and Elizabeth dragging her backward towards the jagged stones. "I'm going to kill that thing." Tears streamed down her face as her body trembled with grief and rage. "I never got to tell him." "Gabriella, you need to stop." Elizabeth hissed, her grip tightening around the girl's arm. "You can't help him now. Michael is gone." Zero reeled his head back and bellowed out a distorted laughter that echoed through the crimson forest as he continued to mutilate Michael's corpse, tearing chunks of flesh and tossing them around him like scraps. The monster's head twisted toward their hiding spot, his misshapen features contorting into something resembling sadistic pleasure. "4 little souls to go," he taunted as he slowly made his way to the stony structure. Gabriella, still in her rage, shrieked loudly and broke free of Elizabeth and Jonas's grip and ran after Zero. "Gabriella, get back here. You're going to get yourself killed." Jonas yelled out, even if she's running too far to be heard. "Elizabeth, stop her." Elizabeth frantically looked around the area to find a way to distract Zero before whatever grim might happen to Gabriella. A small flash caught Elizabeth's eye and her gaze landed on a jagged shard of crystal jutting from the ground. It pulsed with a faint, sickly light, almost like a heartbeat. Without any hesitation, she lunged for it and wrenched it free. Zero raised a massive clawed hand. "Say hi to David and your little boyfriend for me," he sneered, preparing to strike his claws down upon Gabriella's trembling form. The girl clenched her hands into tight fists and charged at the monster, no longer caring about the consequences of her actions as she readied herself to attack. She is going to make this monster regret ever stepping foot possessing Ryder and take the lives against his will. "This is for Michael." Gabriella screamed, her voice breaking with grief as she charged forward just as Zero charged with his arm raised, readying himself to strike at the grieving girl. "Hey!" Elizabeth yelled, grabbing Zero's attention mid-swing. The creature's head turned at her just as she held up the crystal that suddenly flashed a blinding light at Zero's face. The monster recoiled with an unholy screech of agony that shattered the air around him, his massive hands covering his eyes as black ichor spilled like a tarry waterfall between his fingers. The crystal's light pulsed brighter in Elizabeth's grasp, responding to her touch as if it recognized her desperation. "My eyes!" Zero shrieked, his layered voice splintering into multiple tones of rage and pain. "You little bastard!" The monster staggered backward, clawing at his face as smoke rose from where the light had struck him. His massive form thrashed in agony, tail whipping violently through the air as the blades dug into the hard terrain. Elizabeth didn't waste a second. She raced towards to Gabriella, crystal still tightly in her grasp, and slammed its jagged edge into the root still gripping her friend's ankle. The root hissed in pain as it writhed and blackened at the contact, finally releasing Gabriella with a sound like a distant scream. "What the hell were you thinking?" Elizabeth demanded, holding Gabriella by her shoulders, shaking her. "Are you trying to get yourself killed?" Gabriella's tears flowed freely down her face, her eyes locked on what's left of Michael as her legs gave out and she fell to her knees. "I don't care. He killed Michael. He killed him. Move now." Jonas interrupted from the jagged stones, frantically waving his arm towards himself while Penelope watched and waited, her face ashen with horror. "Come on, get to Jonas and Penny," Elizabeth said, pulling Gabriella to her feet as she ushered her friend to the jagged stones where Jonas and Penelope waited. She then looked back at Michael with her lips pressed thinly together as she wiped her own tears away. "I'm sorry, Mikey." She turned around and hurried back as she kept the crystal raised, its light pulsing even stronger as Zero's agonized thrashing grew more violent, the monster still clawing at his smoking eyes. "I'm gonna jab that crystal through your skull," Zero howled, his massive body convulsing as smoke continued to pour from between his fingers. "I will tear your souls from your flesh and use your bodies as sharpeners for my claws." The creature's tail struggled to break free from the hardened terrain, swinging his claws frantically through the air as Elizabeth hurried back to the group behind Gabriella, who was trying to wipe her own persistent tears off her face. Once the two managed to reach toward the jagged stone formation, Jonas reached out and helped them behind the shelter just as Zero's massive fist slammed into the ground where they had been moments before, sending tremors through the crimson earth. "I'm going to get that oaf of a cultist for leaving his toys laying around for these insects to use," Zero roared, his voice splintering into multiple layers of rage. The ground beneath them trembled as he continued his tantrum, slamming his massive fists against the earth. Behind the jagged stones, the group huddled together, hearts racing as they caught their breath. Penelope went over to Gabriella and held the mourning girl tightly into her arms, letting her cry into her shoulder. Gabriella's legs failed her once again, but Penelope managed to carefully put her down to the floor, not breaking her embrace. "Michael, he's," Gabriella hiccuped, blubbering through her tears as she gripped her hands into Penelope's shirt, bunching the fabric between her fingers. "He saved me, but I couldn't save him. I never get to." "Gabby, please take deep breaths," Penelope whispered softly, stroking Gabriella's orange hair, softly swaying her back and forth. "What happened to Michael isn't your fault. He made his choice, so now it is time to make yours going forward." Jonas ran his hand through his black, curly hair, a habit he had trouble breaking whenever he's in a high-stress situation, and exhaled deeply before turning his head and eyed at the shard in Elizabeth's hand. "Is it like the light Thomas had mentioned?" Elizabeth examined the crystal, which continued to pulse with a faint glow. "I don't really know, but it seems to hurt that creature. Though, what does he mean by occultist? Is he referring to one of the members who summoned Zero and the others?" she whispered, turning the crystal over in her hands. The light within seemed to respond to her touch, pulsing brighter with her heartbeat. "I believe so," Jonas murmured, peering through a gap in the stones at the raging monster. "Thomas had mentioned some artifacts that can hurt these entities. That crystal must be one of them. And if a cult member has these laying around, then it could mean that some of them might be rebelling against Zero," Penelope said, her eyes widening in realization. Gabriella broke free from Penelope's embrace and wiped the remaining of her tears away. wincing as she rubbed her ankle. It was already beginning to swell where the root had gripped her. But why would they leave something that could hurt their master just lying around? Before anyone could think up of a possible theory, Zero's thrashing had begun to subside, replaced by a low, menacing growl before he lets out a deafening roar that shook the crimson landscape. The ground trembled with each of his heavy footfalls as he stalked towards the stone formation. "You think you are so clever using Malritha's tools against me," Zero snarled despite the grinning maw still etched on his face, his voice regaining its composure despite the smoke still rising from his black, hollow eyes. "Don't like playing by the rules, don't you? Well then, let's make this challenge more interesting for all of us. I know all of your hiding spots now, and there is nowhere left for you to run away from me." The crystal in Elizabeth's hand pulsed brighter as Zero edged closer and closer, responding to his threat like a living thing. She gripped the glowing mineral tighter, feeling the warmth it emitting spreading up to her arm. "We have only 50 seconds left," Jonas whispered, looking down at his watch as his tone changed to urgent. "We need to keep moving, or else Zero will change his rules." "But what exactly, where can we go?" Gabriella whispered, her eyes widened with panic. "He'll immediately come to us the moment we leave cover." Elizabeth's mind raced as she stared at the crystal in her hand. "Is there a chance we can stay here? I'm having a feeling that we can't use this crystal every time Zero is close to us," she whispered, her thumb tracing the jagged edges. "It could lose power if we overuse it." "As much as I want out of this hellhole, Elizabeth is right," Penelope whispered, glancing nervously at the pulsing crystal. "We need to be strategic. That thing saved us once, but we can't count on it working twice." Elizabeth peered through a small gap between the mossy rocks. "He's circling us like a shark now," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "Jonas, how much time left?" Before Jonas could answer, Zero slammed a massive fist into the jagged stone formation, sending cracks splintering through their shelter. The group pressed themselves against the remaining rocks as dust and debris showered down around them. 15 seconds, Jonas hissed, shielding his watch from falling fragments of their shelter. "We need to keep hold in here as much as we can." Another blow struck the stones, way harder than the first. Several of the jagged spires toppled, narrowly missing Penelope as she scrambled backward out of harm's way. The broken piece ripped the fabric of Gabriella's jean on her thigh, miraculously leaving no cut across her skin. She yelped and backed up, still keeping her position low as she glanced up at the remaining structure that is still standing despite Zero's pounding fists taking it apart. "If you don't leave that little rock, there may be consideration of adding 10 more minutes to the challenge," Zero growled, delivering another thunderous blow that shook the entire formation. "Come on, now. Play fair like good pests, or are you too scared to join your buddies?" 10, 9, 8. "Come on, we're almost there," Jonas whispered urgently, narrowly dodging a sharp stone that embedded itself beside him by just the skin of his teeth. The cracked display fizzling harshly from Zero's proximity while Jonas continued shielding the device from the debris. "We need to hold a bit longer," Elizabeth insisted, gripping the crystal tighter as it pulsed with increasing brightness. The formation shuddered again as Zero struck it from another angle, more stones crumbling around him. 5, 4, 3. Getting closer, Jonas muttered, his voice barely audible over the sound of breaking rock and guttural growls from the monster. With a deafening roar, Zero slammed both fists down. However, a sharp grunt escaped from him mid-swing of his monstrous hands as he backed up. His face contorted and twitched as normal green eyes began to flicker through the void like orbs. Ryder's eyes had appeared, desperate and fighting. "Don't you dare." Ryder's own voice emerged from the monster, desperate and fighting. "You may be able to control me and force me to kill those innocent people, kill David and Michael even, but I can at least fight back. I won't let you take another life from any other of my friends." The massive form staggered backward, claws grasping at his own throat. I wasn't able to save David and Michael in time, but don't count me out regardless. Get out of my way. Do as you're told, Vessel. Zero's voice snarled, battling for dominance as the two fought, the creature's body convulsing. The group watched in stunned silence as Ryder fought hard from within, his consciousness briefly surfacing through Zero's control. Ryder, Elizabeth choked, her voice cracking with hope and desperation as fresh tears fall down her face. Please, fight off that thing. Come on, man. Don't lose control like last time. We need you back, Jonas called out, his voice filled with desperate hope. Ryder's form contorted violently, his back arching at an impossible angle as black ichor bubbled from his mouth. The monstrous figure froze mid-stride, Ryder's green eyes flickered more intensely through the void-like darkness. His clawed hands clutched his head as he let out a loud, pained roar that shook the crimson landscape as a thunderous gong reverberated afterwards, vibrating through their bodies like a physical force. Ryder's form shuddered as he tried to break free from Zero's grasp, even though he knew it was futile. The challenge is over, now let them go, he choked out, his voice strained as the monstrous form convulsed once more, fighting against itself. No. I will not be denied. Zero's voice thundered back, but the landscape around them had already begun to shift. The crimson forest dissolved like smoke, the twisted trees melting into complete nothingness as the group found themselves standing in what appeared to be a vast, maze-like corridor carved from obsidian. Ryder's monstrous form retreated, still clutching his head as he staggered backward into the shadows. Look, I can't hold him back any longer, play his game for now. There might be a chance for you to skip the challenges, but you need to talk to the cultists. Only they know how to deal with Zero. I'll try to. That was all Ryder can choke out before Zero growled and caught hold of Ryder once again, the grinning more returning much to the group's dismay. Enough already, the monster bellowed, slamming his fist onto the wall to emit a loud bang that echoed through the corridor. The first challenge may be over, but there are still 9 of them left. This one shouldn't be as easy for you. The group watched with anger as Zero rolled his shoulders, fully back in control of Ryder's body despite the occasional twitches here and there on his arms. Welcome to the second challenge, he announced, fully regaining his composure as his massive form straightened upwards. This is going to be much more interesting than just hide and seek. You are tasked to retrieve an ancient idol at the heart of this maze. You have exactly 15 minutes to locate it or else you fail. However, let us make this a bit more interesting for you. Zero snapped his fingers to reveal 5 separate pathways stretching out before them, each corridor identical in its obsidian gleam but somehow distinctly different in the way shadows played across their surfaces. Each contains the group's individual names and appeared to be etched into the stone above each entrance. The names glowed with an eerie crimson glow that pulsated like a heartbeat. The crimson glow pulses steadily above each corridor, casting faint reflections across the polished obsidian floor. The letter appeared freshly carved, as though the stone itself had bled the group's names into existence. Elizabeth stepped forward a half pace, her fingers tightening around the crystal shard. The warmth within the powerful mineral throbbed faintly, as if reacting to someone, or something, unseen in the musky air around them. Why are our names on them? Gabriella whispered, her voice barely audible in the cavernous space. The air bit through the torn part of her jeans, the temperature felt burning hot on her exposed leg. Zero tilted his head, his grin widening until the skin around his maw looked as though it might rip. I'm pretty sure that part would have been obvious, he said with sickly pleasantness, his overlapping voices curling together and about like serpents. Each of you must walk your own path. The group stiffened at the devil's words, exchanging panicked glances with one another. This would mean that they will have to split up. What? Jonas muttered, turning to look at Zero with an incredulous look on his face. You heard me loud and clear, Zero replied, his tone turning mocking. 5 little insects, 5 little corridors. 1 for each of you, 1 goal. It is a solo effort for everyone involved. His tail flicked lazily behind him, the blade tip scraping across the obsidian with a sharp metallic screech. The group winced at the sharp sound, with Penelope adding to it by covering her ears. "We will never split up. I don't care what you want from us, but you're not going to get us killed one by one," Elizabeth declared, even if her voice is shaking from the earlier challenge. Zero sharply turned his head to her, hissing under his breath. Now. Rules are rules, my sweet Lizzie," he crooned as his massive claw lifted and pointed toward the group's glowing names. "You do not get to make that choice. Not after playing against the rules like what you did with the first challenge." As if responding to the monster's words, the ground beneath them rumbled and trembled. A low grinding noise echoed through the chamber as thick barriers of obsidian began rising from the floor between the corridors. They climbed higher and higher, dividing the entrance hall into separate channels that funneled toward each individual path. Penelope's face drained of color as she helplessly watched herself getting forced apart from the group. The slabs locked into place with a deafening crack, sealing each corridor from the others. Only a narrowed opening remains in front of each name as Elizabeth looked from one to the other, her pulse hammering. Her own name glowed above the center passage, the left of it laid Gabriella's, further down is Jonas's, and at the far end lays Penelope's. "No, I refuse," Elizabeth snapped, turning toward Zero with fury burning in her eyes, her fists clenching even as the crystal bit into the skin of her palm. "You said retrieve the idol. You said nothing about us doing this alone until now." Zero tilted his head again, the vertebrae popping with wet, unsettling cracks that sent unpleasant chills down the group's spines. "Where would the fun be in knowing? These are my challenges and you, little one, dared tried breaking the rules with that little rock. Besides, the idol will reveal itself to you once you are meant to claim it." Jonas frowned as he tried to make sense of this new challenge. "What will happen if we don't find this idol in the time limit?" he asked, even though a part of him already knew the answer. Zero chuckled as his maw stretched even wider, if that was even possible with Ryder's face he had taken from, black ichor dripping between his teeth like oil. "Then one of you dies," he said simply, as though he is discussing today's weather. "And I get to choose which one. Even if we already got the idol. That's not fair," Gabriella protested, her hands trembling at her sides. The tears from Michael's gruesome death had barely dried on her cheeks. "Fair," Zero repeated before bellowing with laughter, his sadistic mirth echoed through the chamber as it bounced off the obsidian walls until it seemed to come from every direction at once. "Fairness wasn't in the cards, my dear. I promised a little game, that's all." "This is sick," Penelope whispered, her eyes darting between the narrowing pathways. The obsidian walls continued to shift, slowly forcing them toward their respective corridors. A clock appeared in the air above them, formed from swirling crimson light. "You have 15 minutes to find the idol. If you all escaped and are in the heart of the maze together, you'll live for another challenge. If not, you will join your friends and all of the others beyond this realm," Zero instructed as the numbers glowed ominously. "Remember, little lambs, each path is yours alone to walk. Your time starts now. Good luck, you're going to need it for what is waiting for you. Don't worry, some are harmless." The clock above them began to count down with each passing second. The floor beneath the group vibrated once again as from the far ends of the 5 corridors came faint sounds. It is a mix of grinding stone and scraping metal. Elizabeth looked through the narrow spaces quickly, her mind racing and trying to find the source of the sound. "Whatever it is making that noise, we need to play along for now, just like what Ryder had told us," Elizabeth said urgently. "We move fast, stay alive, and if any of us find the idol, let's hope that the rest of us can reach to the heart of the maze alive." Penelope looked down at the darkened corridor that has her name etched above it, her breath quickening every second past. "What if we can't find each other again? What if—" "We will," Jonas interrupted, his voice firm despite the tremor in his hands. Remember what Ryder had said about the cultists. Keep your eyes open for anything that might help us communicate or find each other. The grinding sound grew louder, and Elizabeth turned behind them to see a massive obsidian wall slowly advancing towards them, forcing them towards their designated paths. We don't have much of a choice, she said, grasping the crystal in her tighter that it might draw blood on her hand. Those walls will crush us if we don't move now. Let's go. Then, one by one, they stepped into their assigned corridors. The instant each of them crossed the threshold, the obsidian wall slammed shut behind them with thunderous finality. Elizabeth spun around, discovering that the entrance is now gone. Only smooth black stone that remained where the opening had been. Her heartbeat quickened as she looked through the corridor ahead that stretched into darkness, lit only by faint red veins that ran through the obsidian like lightning frozen in place. The crystal in her hand flickered once, then twice, and then glowed steadily, casting a pale blue light that pushed back the encroaching shadows around her. Elizabeth drew a deep breath, trying to steady her racing heart and ease her shocked nerves as she took her first tentative step forward into the unknown corridor. I can do this, we can do this, she whispered to herself, her voice sounding small and fragile in the oppressive silence. The crystal's illuminating light seemed to respond to her perseverance, glowing slightly brighter as she continued deeper in the passageway. The corridor twisted and turned, branching occasionally into smaller paths that disappeared into darkness. Elizabeth kept to what seemed to her like the main path, using the crystal's light to help her traverse through the passageways of the maze laid out before her. Then, from somewhere deep within the gnarled labyrinth, a distant rushed footsteps echoed through. Elizabeth stopped in her tracks as the hurried footfalls grew louder, accompanied by panting and whimpers that sounded familiar. Elizabeth pressed herself against the wall, holding the crystal close to her chest as its illumination dimmed in response to her fear. Hello. Is anyone here with me? She called out, her voice barely above a whisper. Penny. Jonas. Gabby. No response came, just the steady approach of whatever lurked in the darkness. Elizabeth felt a lump form in her throat, but held the crystal forward, its blue glow illuminating the path ahead of her. The footsteps suddenly ceased. She waited, her breath held, straining to hear any movement. A figure turned the corner, illuminated by the crystal's light. Elizabeth let out a relieved sigh as she saw the familiar orange hair. It was just Gabriella, and the two stared at each other for a good 5 seconds before Elizabeth gave her friend a tight hug. Oh, thank God it's you, Gabby. Elizabeth whispered as she tightened the embrace around Gabriella. I thought I was going to be completely alone in here. Gabriella returned the hug with equal relief, her body trembling slightly. I found a loose panels in the wall that lets me cross between corridors, she explained breathlessly. But I think something is following me. I keep hearing these clicking noises behind me ever since I had left my designated path. Elizabeth pulls back from the embrace, scanning their surroundings with renewed caution. How did you find me? I thought these corridors were supposed to be separate. I don't know, but I don't care. All I did was follow this weird humming noise and suddenly found that loose panel, Gabriella said, her eyes constantly darting back towards the way she had arrived. I'm starting to think these corridors aren't as isolated as Zero wants them to be. Also, I followed the crystal's light since I saw it glowing from the other side. Elizabeth looked down at the crystal in her hand, which pulsed with a steady rhythm. It feels like this thing wants us to find each other, she whispered, turning the shard over her palm. Still, we need to find a way who dropped this crystal from that red forest and why did they dropped it. Hopefully we can find some answers to this. Before Gabriella can reply, the clicking sound she had mentioned suddenly echoed through the corridor. The rapid, metallic tapping seemed to bounce off the obsidian walls. Both of the girls froze, their eyes widening as the noise grew closer. Come on, we need to go. Elizabeth hissed, grabbing Gabriella by their arm. Where's that panel you found? We could use that to find Jonas and Penny, if they haven't run into anyone, or anything unfortunate. Follow me, it's just, but Gabriella had stopped mid-sentence, her eyes fixed on something over Elizabeth's shoulder. Liz. Don't. Turn. Around. The clicking noise intensified, but now accompanied by a wet, raspy breathing that raised goosebumps across Elizabeth's skin. The crystal in her hand pulsed urgently, its blue light flickering like a frightened heartbeat. It's right behind me, isn't it? Elizabeth whispered, not daring to move an inch from where she's standing. Gabriella gave her a barely noticeable nod, her face drained of any color that was left. The clicking grew louder, more insistent, like metallic talons tapping against stone. The crystal in Elizabeth's hand flared suddenly, its light dramatically intensifying to an almost painful and blinding lightness. Without thinking, Elizabeth turned despite being told otherwise and kicked her leg as hard as she could. Wherever Elizabeth had kicked made whomever was behind her to let out a high-pitched whine and collapsed onto the floor. The figure was humanoid in shape, but barely so, as its limbs were unnaturally elongated with a few too many joints that bent in impossible directions. Its face was smooth and featureless except for a wide, lipless mouth filled to the brim with sharp needle-like teeth that clicked together. The creature's skin was nearly the same as the obsidian walls, making it almost blend in the darkness unless squinting hard enough. The creature was doubled over, rolling on the floor as the whines continued to escape its mouth. Did you just kicked it in the lower regions? Gabriella whispered incredulously, her voice a mixture of horror and shock as she stared at the creature still writhing on the obsidian floor. I didn't think I'll hit it there. I just reacted. Elizabeth protested, grabbing Gabriella by her arm. Come on, we need to move before it recovers. With her in tow, they sprinted down the corridor, the crystal's light bouncing wildly across the walls as they ran. The creature behind them lets out another high-pitched whine, but soon erupted into an enraged shriek as its metallic claws scraped against the floor in a loud screech. It was pursuing them. I think you pissed it off, Gabriella announced, trying to keep up with her friend's pace. The clicking sound grew faster and more frantic, echoing all around them as if there were multiple creatures following behind instead of just one. Yeah, no kidding, I did. Elizabeth panted, her eyes darting around for any sign of the panel Gabriella had mentioned. We need to lose this thing. Where is that panel you were talking about? Just up ahead. Gabriella replied, then pointing to a section of a wall that looked almost identical to the rest, save for a thin seam that is barely visible in the crystal's light. Over there. They skidded to a halt as the creature's clicking grew deafeningly close. Just as they tried to push it open, the creature grabbed Elizabeth by the waist and dragged her backward with surprising strength. Elizabeth shrieked in protest as its long, spindly fingers dug into her sides, the crystal nearly slipping from her grasp. Elizabeth! Gabriella screamed as she grabbed hold of her friend's hand and planted her feet onto the flooring to try and keep the creature from taking Elizabeth back any further. Gabriella frantically looked around to find anything to distract this creature until she found a piece of broken obsidian. She grabbed it and jabbed it right into the creature's featureless head, its skin cracked with a sound like glass breaking, revealing disturbing tissue that pulsed sickeningly underneath that oozed black fluid like blood spewing from a critical wound. The creature released Elizabeth and reeled back with another high-pitched shriek as its hands flew to the wound on its head. Come on, push the panel. Gabriella shouted, helping Elizabeth to her feet as the creature thrashed through its pain behind them. Elizabeth threw all of her weight against the section of the wall, feeling it giving away with a grinding sound. The panel slid open just enough for them to squeeze through, revealing a narrow passageway between the corridors. They tumbled inside with Gabriella narrowly missing the creature's reach. I hope Jonas and Penny are okay, Gabriella panted as they pushed the panel closed behind them. The creature slammed against it from the other side, its enraged shrieks muffled by the thick obsidian. Meanwhile, Jonas ran through the twisting obsidian corridors, his own footsteps echoing off the polished black walls. His watch glowed faintly in the darkness, showing that nearly 5 minutes have passed. The corridors seemed designed to confuse, with identical turns and branches that led one nowhere. "This is so stupid," he muttered, pausing at yet another junction. "Where's that crystal of Lizzie's when you need it? It could be useful to help find any patterns to this place." A low chuckle filled the air around Jonas, causing him to frantically search around for the source of the noise. He then groaned at the familiar sound. "Of course it's that thing." "Zero," Jonas sighed with obvious disgust, his eyes scanning the darkness for any sign of the devil. "How about you show yourself instead of playing these mind games? Better yet, come over here and face me head on if you think you're so tough." "Oh, don't flatter yourself," Zero's voice echoed from everywhere all at once, layered and distorted. "You're not nearly entertaining enough for my personal attention right now. It is all the more humorous to watch your friends struggle for their lives. Lizzie and Gabby rather cheat their way, so I have to give them a rather pointed encounter." Jonas's blood had ran cold at the devil's words. "What the hell did you do to them?" "Nothing they haven't brought upon themselves," Zero replied with that annoyingly sickened glee in his voice. "Though I must say, Elizabeth impressed me with that kick. It almost made me feel sorry for my little pet." "Almost." Jonas clenched his fists, forcing himself to remain calm despite the absolute fury boiling within him. He knew that engaging with this monster would only make things worse for himself, so he bit back a retort. Jonas needed to find the idol and reach his friends fast. Checking his watch again, he noticed that another minute had ticked away. 10 minutes. The illuminating numbers on Jonas's cracked watch seemed way too bright in the suffocating darkness of the corridor. Each second that passed by felt heavier than the last, pressing against his chest in a physical weight. Jonas exhaled slowly from his nose and forced his hands to unclench. He knew that panicking would only get him killed faster. The corridor ahead of him forked into 3 identical directions, each one stretching into the same endless obsidian darkness. The faint red veins inside the walls pulsed lazily, casting warped reflections across the polished flooring. It felt like he was standing inside the veins of some colossal creature. Jonas noticed that unlike the smooth walls, the floor carried faint scuff marks, tiny scratches that are barely visible. "It looks like someone's been through here," he whispered, crouching down to further inspect the marks. They seemed to lead toward the left passage, so he followed until the corridor behind him shifted with a grinding groan. Jonas whirled around just in time to see the path he had come from sealed itself shut as a slab of obsidian slid across the opening. "Of course it'll close behind me," he whispered in annoyance, but turned around and hurried down the left path as his footsteps echoed too loudly for comfort. Every sound had bounced endlessly through the corridor, making it impossible to determine where anything actually was. As he ran, he heard sounds that are slow and wet dragging across the floor. Jonas immediately halted and froze as he listened. The sound came from somewhere ahead, or something that was moving through the darkness. Jonas's hands found themselves searching around his pockets until he came across something metallic. He pulled out and used his watch's light to shine it. It was a pocket knife, and while it felt absurdly small compared to what he and the group had went through, it was better than having to fight whoever is approaching him empty-handed. "How convenient," Jonas muttered under his breath before unfolding the blade, readying himself as the scraping grew louder. A shape emerged at the far end of the hall, which appeared similar to a human at first. But Jonas knew that the proportions are far from recognizable. The creature dragged itself forward on 2 elongated arms while its legs dragged uselessly behind like broken limbs. Its body was pale and stretched dangerously thin, the skin pulled over bones like parchment. Its head hung at an unnatural angle, twitching as if trying desperately to correct a dislocated neck. Jonas wasn't sure whether to fight this thing with his pocket knife or just make a run for it. The creature lifted its head up, a low hiss escaping from its mouthless face. A red vertical seam across its skull peeled apart to reveal rows of sharp, jagged teeth lining the inside like a carnivorous flower. Jonas gripped on his pocket knife, though he instinctively stepped back. "You have got to be kidding me," he whispered as the creature's head twitched at the sound of his voice and lunged forward with a violent jerk. Jonas stepped to the side, nearly having a claw to his nose by a hair before he charged and stabbed it in the neck with his pocket knife. The creature shrieked in pain when Jonas ripped the knife sideways, black fluid oozing from the wound like oil. The creature staggered back, its limbs flailing frantically as it tried to stem the flow with its elongated fingers. Jonas didn't wait, he turned and ran as another shriek erupted behind him, this time sounding enraged. The thing gave chase, its limbs slapping against the floor with horrifying speed. The dragging sound became a rapid scraping frenzy as it crawled after Jonas. He sprinted through the corridor, skidding around a sharp turn. His shoulder slammed into the wall, sending a rush of pain from the impact, but he didn't slow down. The maze twisted again and Jonas had found himself at another fork. Without thinking, he picked the middle path while the creature behind him slammed into the corner he'd just rounded. Its shriek echoed like metal tearing as Jonas pushed himself harder before the corridor suddenly widened. There, laid in the center of the chamber ahead, stood a pedestal carved from blackened stone. Resting on top of it is a small statue about the size of a human heart, depicting a twisted humanoid figure kneeling with its hands raised towards the sky. The surface of the statue shimmered faintly with dark crimson veins. "Is this the idol that Zero tasked us to find?" Jonas asked himself, slowly approaching towards. Jonas slowly approached the statue before glancing back. The creature's claws scraped around the corner, closing in seconds away. Jonas turned to the pedestal and ran just as another hand shot out for the statue. He jerked back as his eyes met with Gabriella's. Both of them were reaching for the idol simultaneously. Elizabeth rounded the corner and frantically looked around. "Where is she? Where is Penny?" Elizabeth demanded, walking around the clearing in search of her older sister. "She's not with you?" Jonas asked, his eyes widening with concern as he glanced back at the corridor where the creature's scraping grew louder. "We had no luck in finding her," Gabriella quickly explained, her hand hovering over the statue. "Is this the idol that Zero wanted us to obtain? Should we grab it?" "Wait," Elizabeth warned, the crystal in her hand pulsing frantically. "This feels way too easy. Why would Zero just leave this out in the open?" The creature pursuing Jonas burst into the chamber with a shrill cry, its mouthless face splitting open wider as it lunged toward them. At the same time, a sharp piece of obsidian was flung straight into the creature's chest, sending it sprawling backward with a shriek of agony. It came from Penelope, who emerged from another corridor, who was the one that had thrown the shard at the creature, her face streaked with stained black blood and a fresh cut across her cheek. "Don't you dare go near them again, you monster," she shouted, grabbing another jagged shard from her pocket. "Penny!" Elizabeth cried out, running to her sister and enveloping her in a tight hug. "How did you manage to go through the maze yourself?" Penelope returned the embrace, just as relieved as her sister is while remaining her gaze on the downed monster before them. "I have no idea, but I do not care. I had enough of these creatures already with their shrieks. It's giving me a headache." "I know the feeling," Gabriella muttered, rubbing her temples to emphasize her shared struggle. She then turned to the idol with a sigh of annoyance. "I don't care if this is too easy, I'm grabbing this thing." Before anybody could stop her, Gabriella grabbed the idol and pried it off the pedestal. Suddenly, the red veins along the walls began to flare violently, flooding the entire room with blood-red colored light. Soon, a deafening roar of laughter erupted throughout the maze, coming from Zero himself. Well, the devil's voice echoed with malicious delight. "Look who all found the prize. Such a ballsy move to pick it up the way you did, Gabby." The group huddled together as Gabriella clenched the idol in her hand tightly. "Then, that would mean that this challenge is finally over," Jonas said through gritted teeth as he looked up. Zero chuckled deeply at the declaration. "Oh, no. Did you really think it would be that simple? There is one weensy addition to this challenge. Oh, come on. Elizabeth thought to herself, looking around frantically to find a way to leave the red illuminated room. There has to be a way out of here. I am not letting us get stuck because of this damn devil. The creature that had been struck by Penelope ripped the piece of shard off its chest, the wound knitting itself back up in sickening squelches. It lets out several clicks as more shapes crawled out of the corridors. There's 2, then 3, then 5 things that dragged and shuffled towards the group, their split skull mouths opening wide with hisses and gurgling growls. The creature that Elizabeth and Gabriella had encountered ripped through the final corridor, its obsidian skin flashing blinding reflective lights as it snarled at the 2 girls. The group backed away from the pedestal as Gabriella clutched the idol tightly. "You said find the idol," Penelope called out, keeping close to her sister. "And that, you did," Zero replied with eerie gleefulness, his massive shadow passing across the chamber ceiling. "But you didn't ask what happens after someone or somebody finds it?" The sextet of creatures began to circle around the group slowly, their heads twitching in unnatural jerks as they studied their preys. The idol in Gabriella's hands suddenly pulsed with heat intense enough that could nearly bordered on burning the skin. A deep vibration traveled through it and into her arms. Zero's laughter deepened at the spectacle. "That little idol holds tremendous powers," the devil explains lazily. "Something that neither of you can comprehend. But now, the timer has been changed. You now have a minute to survive. But that crystal you are holding will have its powers removed. It's all about using your reaction time." The group's hearts drop to their stomachs. Elizabeth more so as she watches the crystal in her hand flickered and faded into uselessness. But hope still surged through her that maybe after this challenge, it'll return, and she can use it. Pushing that aside, Elizabeth pocketed the crystal with a defeated sigh. "Good luck. Otherwise, you'll become their dinner and they are very hungry," Zero continued as the creatures began creeping closer and closer. One of the monsters lunged with startling speed right at Gabriella, which prompted Jonas to push her out of harm's way. She collapsed to the ground, but kept a firm grip on the idol and shot her friend a grateful look as Jonas swiftly dodged the creature's attack and slashed with his pocket knife, catching it across what is possibly its shoulder. Black ichor sprayed across the obsidian floor as the monster recoiled from the pain and lets out a frustrated cry. "Everyone back to back," Elizabeth shouted as she grabbed a jagged piece of obsidian from the floor beside her. "Don't let these things surround us." The group formed a tight circle just as what Elizabeth had ordered, each of them facing outward as the creatures circled them with predatory patience. The idol in Gabriella's hands continued to pulse with heat as the crimson veins within the carved artifact glowed brighter with each passing second. Without thinking, Gabriella raised the idol above her head as high as possible. "I don't know what this thing can do, but I am not waiting any longer to find out," she yelled, her voice cracking with desperation. The creatures froze mid-lung, their lanky frames quivering as the idol's pulsating light greatly intensifies. The crimson veins within the enchanted artifact spread outwards like liquid flames, creating a wide web of light that surrounded the group in a protective dome. The monsters shrieked and backed away, their elongated limbs scrabbling against the obsidian floor as they retreated. "Holy crap, it gives us a barrier," Jonas exclaimed as the creatures clawed at the crimson dome of light, their taloned fingers screeching against the protective surface like nails on glass. "Let's not celebrate just yet," Elizabeth warned, keeping her makeshift weapon raised. "We still have 40 seconds left, and I really doubt this barrier will hold forever." True to her words, cracks began forming along the glowing dome in a spiderweb-like formation as the creatures attacked with renewed ferocity. The idol in Gabriella's hands grew even hotter to the point of scalding temperatures, causing her to struggle in maintaining her grip on it. "Please let it pass by. This thing is burning me," Gabriella cried out, her fingers reddening from the heat, but she refused to drop the artifact. "I don't know how much longer I can hold it." The cracks in the dome widened as one of the creatures slammed its full weight against the barrier. The fractures started chipping off as one of them tried to tear a bigger opening to reach the group inside. Then, a small, but distant booming sound erupted as the creatures fell on their backs, writhing and shrieking in agony before they burst into a bloody, gory mess. Inky black blood and viscera flying in various directions and hitting the walls, floors, and the barrier. What? Zero's voice boomed over them, laced with fury and confusion. How in the... What did you... Gabriella turned her gaze at the idol, just as dumbfounded as the devil tormenting them. The hand of the artifact is glowing a deep purple with black swirls, coalescing into a color that appeared as the closest dark violet she could have seen. Then, her reddening hands began to revert back as a cooling sensation emanated from the idol, like a comforting blanket that covered the entire group. What even is this thing? Gabriella muttered as she kept her grip firm on the artifact, readying herself for any surprises. The violet illumination deepened further and thickened in the air like a living mist. It clings itself to Gabriella's hands, coiling around her fingers like a snake before drifting outward in slow, deliberate tendrils. The remains of the creatures twitched on the floor as their blackened gore pulled inward as if they are being dragged by an unseen force. Whatever is happening to them had made Elizabeth's breath get caught in her throat. "Gabby," she whispered, turning her head enough to look at her friend. "Whatever you do, don't let go of that thing, and don't move." But it was too late, as the dark violet energy snapped itself back into the idol like a recoiling tendon. The chamber had fell deathly still as every smear of black ichor, every torn limb, every fragment of those creatures are gone, but not dissolved or burned. Just taken without leaving a mess behind. A low, distorted hum rolled through the room before Zero laughed. However, his laughter isn't amused like it would have, but rather an interested one. "Well now," he began, his voice slithered through the chamber, quieter, more focused. "That is new. One of cultists' little toys have a new function, that's a first." The idol began to pulse once more, and Gabriella nearly dropped it as a jolt ran up her arms. There wasn't any pain behind it, but it felt as something more invasive. Like the artifact is alive and is studying her. "I don't like this," Penelope whispered, gripping her shard tighter. "I really don't like this at all." Jonas didn't respond to this, his eyes locking on the floor where the creatures had been. "Something tells me that these things are not really dead." Elizabeth sharply turned to Jonas, her brows furrowing. "What do you mean they're not really dead?" "It's like they were absorbed," Jonas clarified, his voice tightening. "That thing in Gabriella's hands is doing more than just protecting us. It's like it harvested them." Silence filled the air as Gabriella stared down at the idol in her hands like it had betrayed everyone trying to survive. "But she started, her voice cracking. "I didn't do anything." "We know, Gabby." "It isn't your fault," Penelope said softly, keeping her eyes glued on the artifact. "It might have been one of the tools that those cultists left, like the crystal Elizabeth picked up." The crimson veins along the walls dimmed slightly, as if the maze itself had taken notice. Zero's shadow stretched across the ceiling once more, but he didn't approach this time. Well done," he said slowly, each of his words deliberate. "I have to admit, I am impressed. You have found yourselves something valuable." He tilted his head at an unnatural angle. "For once in your miserable existence, you might actually stand a chance." The group didn't relax at his praise, if one can even call it that. If anything, it just made them more tense and uncomfortable. The clock above the group flickered and glitched, emitting barely audible static before stabilizing again. 0 minutes and 0 seconds lit up as a deep, resonant gong-like sound echoed through the chamber that wasn't heard before. The second challenge was over, however nothing in the environment around them changed. No walls shifting, no exits opening, and no relief for anyone. Rather, the idol in Gabriella's hands pulsed once again, but way harder than last time as the violet energy lashed outward across the floor in branching lines. It carved into the obsidian like cracks in glass. A low, monotonous groan emitted from the maze as a response, a pained sound that reverberated through the group's bones. Guys. Jonas said slowly, pointing at the pedestal behind them. Something isn't right. As they turned to face what had held the idol, they discovered that it's sinking into ground, melting away like wax of a lit candle. In its place laid a circular symbol that emerged that is etched deep into the obsidian, filled with the same violet-black energy the idol is now radiating from. Elizabeth felt her stomach drop to the floor as she stared at the symbol. Something tells me this isn't an exit. Pointing out the obvious shouldn't be your priority, Zero sneered, though there was an almost pleased tone in his voice. But you're right, it is not your way out of here. Then, the symbol flared and engulfed the group in a light of violet black. They covered their eyes from the blinding light as what felt like biting cold wind seeping into them. As the light faded, the group uncovered their eyes and noticed they are not in the same room anymore once again. This time, they are in what seems to be a cemetery that had seen better days. Endless black grass stretched across the seemingly infinite horizon, littered with tombstones that either are unmarked or damaged beyond repair. Ahead of them lays a worn-down church with tinted glass. "Where are we?" Penelope asked, her voice barely inaudible from the persistent sound of the wind whistling. Jonas turned in a slow circle, his broken watch no longer lighting up. The air tasted stale and bitter, like dust mixed in with copper. "I don't think we're in the maze anymore," he muttered, his eyes scanning the decrepit headstones. Some leaned at precarious angles, others had toppled entirely into the blackened earth. "Brilliant observation, Captain Obvious," Gabriella said weakly, her hands still clutching the idol. The artifact had cooled considerably, though the faint traces of that violet-black energy remained, occasionally flickering across the surface like distant lightning bolts. Elizabeth knelt down and picked up a handful of the black grass. It crumbled between her fingers like ash, leaving dark stains across her palm that later faded like smoke from a bonfire. "This place feels wrong," she whispered, letting the remains of the inky meadow fall through her fingers. "Like it's been dead for a very long time." A distant bell tolled somewhere within the church, its sound hollow and mournful as it echoed through the desolate area. The group collectively flinched at the noise, drawing closer together instinctively. The tinted glass windows of the church flickered with an inner light that pulsed in rhythm with the idol in Gabriella's hands. Then, Zero's booming laughter rang through, immediately tensing up the group even further. However, the voice sounded distant this time, as if coming from somewhere beyond the decrepit church. "Such persistent little things, you are," Zero's voice echoed, though it carried a strange distortion that hadn't been present before. "I must confess, this wasn't part of my original plan. That idol you carry has complicated matters." "No matter. Since I cannot reach you here, don't think that all of my challenges are avoidable. Until then, how about I introduce to you to some old friends of mine? As a way for you to get to know the family a bit better." "This monster is getting on my nerves," Elizabeth thought bitterly as she tightened her grip on the crystal that is still tucked in her pocket. "Ahead of you is where one of them resides," Zero continued, his voice dropping into something almost reverent. "I hope you get along with the religious type." Just as the monster said this, the wind weakened before stopping into complete silence that felt suffocating. Gabriella's gasping pants sounded too loud, and Jonas could hear the faint crackling inside his broken watch. Somewhere beneath the soil shifted with a sickeningly wet, dragging sound that made Elizabeth and Penelope feel sick to their stomachs. The church bell rang once again, but the sound vibrated through their bodies, as the tinted windows of the church illuminated brighter, revealing a silhouette moving from behind the glass. A tall figure, wearing old and ruined clothing that a priest would wear, is suspended slightly above the air like if hung by an invisible rope. Penelope immediately stepped backward. "No. Nope. Absolutely not. There's no way in hell are we going in there. You and me both, but it seems we don't have that much of a choice," Jonas muttered as he kept his gaze at the silhouetted figure, looking for any movements. The path ahead of the group began to change right in front of their eyes. The inky, black grass slowly folded themselves inward like living veins to reveal a narrow trail of cracked stone leading directly toward the rotten church doors. The idol in Gabriella's hands pulsed once, then twice, before it physically tugged. She nearly stumbled forward as the artifact pulled towards the church. "Okay, then. This is new," she hissed, gripping it even tighter. Elizabeth narrowed her eyes. "Does it want us to go in there? Or whatever is inside wants that thing," Penelope countered immediately. Another laugh echoed from Zero, though this is way more softer. "Clearly, you misunderstand," he crooned in that sickening tone. "The church isn't dangerous." He paused for what felt like hours. "The things in these headstones are." The group collectively grimaced, but Penelope added by rolling her eyes despite her arms shaking. "Can this thing stop talking like a cartoon villain for 5 minutes already?" she muttered under her breath, a hint of frustration etched into her shaky voice. "I heard that, insect." "Good. I'll say it louder next time." Penelope snapped back, but earned a nudge from her younger sister. Before Zero could respond again, the ground beneath one of the nearby tombstones cracked open with a sudden snap. Everyone within the group whipped toward the sound as a crooked grave marker tilted sideways when the black dirt violently shifts from beneath the ruined stone. Long, gray, human-like fingers erupted from the soil before the rest of the arm surfaced. Jonas immediately backed away when it swiped in attempt to grab his ankle. "Get out of their reach." Another arm clawed upward as a figure slowly pulled itself from the earth with jerking, unnatural movements. It resembled a person that has been buried decades too long, its skin grayed and splitting as its jaw hung slightly crooked. Dark roots and thorn-like growths pierced through its torso like the earth itself had grown through the animated remains. Its empty eye sockets began to ignite a blinding violet color as it lets out a skin-crawling roar at the group. Penelope let out a strained noise that sounded like a mix of a gasp and a curse. "Why is it always zombies?" More graves began shaking. It started with 1, then 3, then 10, and soon all around them. The cemetery erupted into movement as bodies from the past clawed their way from beneath the blackened soil. Some crawled out without legs while others violently twitched as they stood. One, though, dragged an entire coffin lid that is chained onto its wrist. Gabriella's pulse skyrocketed when stepping back from one of the animated carcasses' lazy lunge. "Run. We need to run, now." Nobody argued with this as the group bolted down the stone path towards the church as the dead surged from behind. The creatures moved horribly fast despite their decaying and rotten forms, their limbs audibly snapping and inhumanely twisting as they sprinted across the field. Jonas looked over his shoulder just in time to see one leap nearly 15 feet through the air. "How in the hell are they this damn fast? Why wouldn't they be?" Penelope shouted back. The church doors loomed closer, the structures massive and ancient, covered in strange carvings that seemed to move when stared at for too long. Elizabeth reached to them first and slammed both of her hands against the doors. "Guys, help me open this." Jonas joined her immediately, both of them shoving against the rotten wood as the creatures closed in behind them. The doors groaned but barely moved even an inch. Gabriella clutched the idol tighter as the violet-black energy suddenly spread across its surface. The symbols etched on the doors reacted instantly as the carvings lit up one by one. A loud clang filled the air as the doors unlocked, the entrance burst inward in a violent jerk. "Go go go!" Penelope shrieked as she tried pushing and pulling the others inside. The group stumbled inside just as the first corpse reached them. Its sharp, crooked claws scraped inches from Penelope's leg before Jonas and Gabriella slammed both doors shut with all of their strength. A loud boom echoed as something hit the other side immediately after before more impacts followed behind. The entire church trembled from the reverberations of dozens of bodies throwing themselves against closed entrance. Inside the church was either slightly better or somehow worse. The interior stretched far longer than it should have been. Endless rows of pews disappeared into the darkness with rotten chandeliers hung from a ceiling they can't fully see. Melted candles lined the walls as their black flames burned silently. At the far end of the church, something sat in front of the altar in a motionless stance. Their back is turned, as if all the noise and the group screaming hadn't caught their attention. It appeared vaguely human beneath the gown and blackthorn vines wrapped around their body like restraints. The top half of their head looked dull gray with several strands of hair adorned the otherwise bald top. The bottom half, though, is completely gone and left with only parts of the skull from the nose down. They then moved their head before the rest of their body followed to face the group. The sound of bones snapping echoed through the church as they opened their eyes, revealed nothing but empty sockets. "Oh! Visitors," they called out, their voice low but raspy that sent goosebumps on the group's skin. "It seems like you're lost, with questions that are begging to be answered." They tilted their head, their spine creaking as they observed the group. "You all appear familiar, ah yes. You are the master's playthings. Come, sit. Those wretched creatures won't reach you in here." The group exchanged uncertain glances, none of them moving from their positions near the doors. The pounding from outside had lessened but didn't stop completely, a constant rhythmic thudding that made the ancient wood groan. "Who are you?" Elizabeth demanded, even if her voice remained trembling, her hand moving instinctively to the crystal in her pocket. It felt warm again, pulsing faintly against her palm. The figure's skeletal jaw shifted in what might be an attempt at a smile, though without lips or flesh, it looked more like a grimace if anything. "Who am I?" they repeated, their tone carrying a hint of amusement and a small tinge of understanding of the group's skepticism. Such a simple question with such a complicated answer. They raised one withered, bony hand, the thorn vines constricting tighter around their arm as they gestured toward the row of pews. "I am Father Morabane, or what remains of the man I used to be. I was the one who conducted the most of Zero and their group's summoning, with the help of the cult that is." "Group? Cult?" Jonas repeated, his eyes widened from behind his glasses, both from the mention of the name and the revelation. "Yes," Morabane confirmed with a slow nod. "Our master, Xeroclitus of Voidzudas XLV, the Devil of Shadows, is one of the 4 devils we'd summoned. They are appropriately named the Withering regime. They had promised us with immortality in exchange for sacrifices. Zero wanted a strong-willed man that harbored deep anger, the kind that could fuel their manifestation in this plane of existence. So, we have found one. Your friend Ryder, I believe is his name. A relic was in his possession that assisted us in achieving the vessel. All that grief he has bottled up and the constant negligence he faced. It was the perfect candidate." Elizabeth clenched her fists at her sides. "Are you saying that you deliberately chose Ryder specifically? That all of this was planned?" "Planned isn't what I'd use," Morabane replied with a rattling chuckle that sounded like wind through hollowed bones. "This has been in motion for decades. We are given orders on what the devils sought after. It's been this way for centuries. We arise, we take what we need, someone stops us, our progress resets, then, cycle repeats. This is the year Zero is confident with, but I'd say he's a fool." Despite knowing that there are going to be more questions than answers, the group oddly felt at ease. Maybe Father Morabane could help them understand more.